Thank you. I think we've had a great introduction. Thanks, Sabrina, and thank you. I think just to re-highlight, so Padre Joanna went on a sabbatical in 2012 out to Louisiana State Penitentiary, and you'll hear us talk about Angola, and we'll talk about the site of Angola later. While she was there, she spent 2 months as a life and coaching skills mentor to the inmates, which was a fascinating experience. And when Joanna took over from as a reservist chaplain at AGR Winchester last year, she came and, as you've heard, a great sort of background, and I sort of read the background, and we've had our first chat, and she talked to me about her time that she spent in the prison, which was absolutely fascinating. And I said, right, we've got to get ourselves out there, because there's absolute overlap in terms of how we train young recruits at Winchester itself. Because it provided a real story about leadership and role modeling through a completely different prism. So in July last year, we flew out to the States and spent 3 days in the prison, complete open access to the prison, and our presentation will sort of talk to that over the next sort of 45 minutes or so. This comes with a slight caveat. These are our views and our lived experience. We're here to offer another perspective on leadership and role modeling, which is relevant to the world that we live in. I think my sort of note and my key takeaway is that our world, in terms of the training world, deals with millennials, which is a young section commander, the young instructor, and also Generation Z, which is the youngster that comes in having chosen to join the army. Lots of theories, lots of research in this area. For me, my own view is that these groups are more motivated when taught how to think, not what to think. So taught how to think, not what to think. And our approach at Winchester reflects this approach, particularly when it comes to leadership and integrity.
So I want to begin with a question. If I were to ask you what the values of the British Army are, how long would it take you to remember them all? Feel free to write them down, because we'll be returning to them. And how do we go from knowing them to becoming them? When I first stood up to present the values and standard training for the first time with one of my squadrons, I was introduced by the OC, who said very breezily, so this is your annual values and standards training test. And it's a box-ticking exercise, one that we just have to go through once a year, so let's get it done with. Over to you, Padre. And if rattling off sea drills is just an annual occurrence, then no problem. But if we want more than that from our soldiers and officers, if we want to see them embody those values and become them in the ordinary and extraordinary moments, then we need more than an annual academic test and the belief that it's a mere box-ticking exercise. We're here to tell you a story of how one of the bloodiest and most violent prisons in America took words about morality, doctrine, and policy and turned them into a practice, a living, breathing community where character and values are lived out.
So, just as a sort of a bit of a geography test for you, New Orleans in the deep dark south, and you can see on the bottom right-hand history. Louisiana Penitentiary sits about sort of 2.5, 3 hours north of New Orleans itself, and in the sort of in the swamplands. In terms of what it looks like, Louisiana or Angola plantation, owned by Isaac Franklin back in the 19th century, and Franklin was a co-founder of one of the largest slave trading firms in the US. The site itself is 18,000 acres, and it opened as a state prison in 1901. And as you can see from the map, it has the Mississippi River on 3 sides, and then to the east, the Tunica Hills so it's a pretty formidable sort of site. So if you were to effectively break out of the prison, and prison buildings are set up high security, you'd effectively have a 10K run to either the river, which is about 250 meters wide, running at about 5 knots, alligators, swirl pools, so pretty dangerous environments. And actually covered by drones, so if anyone escapes, there's a drone plan as well as prison guards and bloodhounds to chase you down to that area. Or alternatively, you could run off into the east, where you've got to face the Tunica Hills and the terrain, the arduous terrain that you'd have to cover, and that has a few black bears and panthers associated with it. So if you were to escape, then I'm sure you'd have a view of which way you would want to go, if any.
For those of you who have seen The Green Mile or Dead Man Walking, you'll be familiar with some of the history of Angola. But let me give you a few snapshots of how it developed into a state prison during the last century and what it was like to be incarcerated there. Nicknamed after the birthplace of its first slaves, by the 1930s, Angola still resembled slavery, with petty thieves sent there for hard labor and prisoners being worked to death under the harsh conditions. After a prison break, several escapees were rounded up and rehoused in the newly built Red Hat building, a row of concrete cells with small windows, a concrete shelf for a bed, and iron doors, which in one case was welded shut on a prisoner until he died 7 years later. The row of cells was broken only by a corridor leading into a concrete room where gruesome Gertie, the electric chair, was housed. Each year, 1 in 10 inmates received stab wounds, and the likelihood of being murdered in your bed, in your sleep, was so great that men would sleep 2 to a bed so that they could take it in turns to keep watch throughout the night. It's unsurprising that hardened criminals would break down on being told they were going to be sent to Angola. In 1952, 31 inmates cut their Achilles tendon in protest at the prison's conditions. By the 1970s, when rape was common, inmates were advised by corrections officers on arrival to fashion themselves a weapon to protect themselves. By the 1990s, riots and hostage situations led to the deaths of both inmates and corrections officers, and huge financial cost.
Clearly today the prison has modernised. It's widely recognised as one of the toughest prisons of the world, and the state of Louisiana is known as a lock-up state, with 1 in 93 citizens incarcerated, so 1 in 93 citizens behind bars. That equates to 36,000 inmates statewide at a cost to the state of nearly $700 million. Angola itself has over 6,100 inmates. Over 4,000 are serving life without parole, so absolutely no chance of escaping or getting out. 1,500 are older than 55. 1,600 have served over 21 years, and each prison costs the state $20,000 per year. And they are split into different prisons. So first of all, death row. The slide you can see on the left-hand side is the old death row, which is actually now a museum. The slide on the bottom right is a new modernised death row. But ultimately, death row is those people that have been sentenced to death. They've gone out, conducted first-degree murder in the majority of the time. And there's absolutely no chance of them getting out. In the prison itself, in death row, it's actually quite a surreal experience because it's actually quite clinical. It's very quiet. When you talked to, and we had the opportunity to talk to some of the prisoners there, they're really quiet, and just you wouldn't have expected them to be the sort of the criminals with the crime they'd been associated with. They are allowed to socialise, so in the corridor, very similar to what you see there, for about an hour or two a day. So an hour or two a day they can talk to the other inmates. And then once a week they're allowed out, and a new regime, once a week they're allowed out into the courtyard to get a bit of fresh air. Okay, so pretty sort of extreme conditions. The next place is Camp J, and this is where I'd say that the bad lads live. Okay, and for those maybe who've experienced operations in Afghanistan, it's a bit like going into the THF in Camp Bastion. You go into Camp J and you can feel an air of negativity. You look into the eyes of the prisoners. They're really bad. You can see in their eyes they're really, really bad people. They move around in 4-point chains in orange boiler suits. And you can see from the slide they're allowed an hour's exercise a day in effectively large kennels. And then when you go into the prison, into the sort of the cell block itself, if you just can imagine 35-degree heat, 100% humidity, you've got these great big fans going, you've got TV screens which have got the volume turned up but actually aren't tuned in, so lots of white noise. You've got lots of shouting, you've got loos being flushed, showers being run, you've got prisoners shouting at each other. And the key thing from this is you've got to be there for 25 years. Okay, just think about how you would be after spending that amount of time in the prison, in those sort of conditions. Alternatively, you could be in the main prison, and whilst the conditions in the main prison are somewhat better than in Camp J, here, again, you're there for life. You're in dorms of about 90 people, in bunk beds. You've got your worldly possessions, which is your locker at the end of your bed. That is your worldly possessions. You have to go to the loo communally, the showers communally. You've got no personal space, no personal time. And again, you've got to be there for the rest of your life. Just think about what that would do to you as a person.
Despite the modernisation, there was still a high rate of drug usage, corruption and murder and abuse. The wider population would refer to the inmates as non-persons and supported the idea that locking them up and throwing away the key was the safest policy. And yet this didn't create a safe environment, not for its inhabitants, the staff, or for the wider community. The beginning of change began under Warden Burl Kane's tenure. 3 months after his arrival in '95, he had to undertake his first execution. He talks about going through that process smoothly and then looking down at the dead man on the gurney and realizing that he had not made any effort to talk to that man or prepare him for the end of his life, to make sure that his soul was at peace. The words of his mother came to mind: God's going to hold you accountable for those men's souls, that you give them a chance to make their peace in life and death, and you better make sure that you do that. In that light bulb moment, Kane realized he hadn't done that, and that he needed to provide practical opportunities to enable the men to change, not merely to educate them and just make a smarter criminal, but actually enable them to become different. So think about this. What would it do to you to find yourself behind bars with no possibility of parole or ever being released? What would you become? So far, the leadership had not been effective. Prison guards had no vocation. They chose between working at McDonald's or Angola, and the pay was roughly the same. So they were vulnerable to corruption. Everyone was aware of the rules. People were familiar with shakedowns, lockdowns, and yet it resulted, unsurprisingly, in a precarious tension between the staff and the inmates. It didn't create a safe environment. Burl Kane recognized that criminals are essentially selfish human beings. So changing the culture meant transforming individuals into a community who took care of one another. He began with a simple Bible study course. This is the Deep South. And it brought inmates together to talk and discuss and think about a different way of living. Its popularity grew and led to someone making the offhand suggestion that Cain should invite the Southern Baptist Theological Union to start a degree course at the prison. Cain took that idea seriously and rang them up to ask them. The Theological Seminary agreed and began running a 4-year degree course. Many men applied just to get out of work in the fields or to sit in an air-conditioned classroom for 4 years, but you can't sit in a classroom like that learning about this kind of stuff for 4 years without it having an impact. And the change among the inmates was noticeable. The violence dropped remarkably. The number of violent incidents and write-ups dropped by almost 80%. As the first 140 students graduated, Burl Cain recognized that many of his known gang leaders are now running around his prison yard, but now they're pastors. And he thought, what am I going to do with them all? And he said the inspiration struck in the shower. One day he suddenly thought, I'm going to send them in twos as inmate missionaries to other prisons. Like Jesus sent out his disciples in twos, I'm going to send out these guys in twos, but I'm going to send them to medium-term prisons where the inmates are going to be released and go back into their communities. And so he did that. They would go for maybe 6 months, maybe 3 years, and the violence levels dropped in those prisons as well. So this new opportunity brought about 4 things for the men: purpose, community, achievement. And having experienced those things, often for the first time in their lives, it then gave them the freedom to choose who they were going to be and what they were going to live for. Men discovered intellectual challenge, but also a way to do something positive and transformational with that, a calling to serve others. So we're going to tell you a bit about what this actually looks like. On our arrival in Francisville, the nearest town to Angola, it's 20 miles away, we met some students in a cafe, and they came up to us because we were dressed like this, and they wanted to know where we were from and what on earth we were doing in the back end of nowhere. And we told them we're going up to Angola to visit for a few days. And they told us how they had been bussed up to the prison as teenagers to be prepared for their confirmation by some of the Roman Catholic inmates at the prison. Now these pastors minister at around 728 Bible services or studies or gospel singing services a month, and they take the funeral services for the inmates when they die. For us, the point of interest lies in how men can go from violence and destruction to peace and reconciliation. Like the men who got together and discussed the fact that their children are 7 times more likely to end up in prison simply because they, the dads, are incarcerated. And they talked about what they could do to change this. Now, I wonder what you would think about doing in that situation. For them, it started with the only thing that they could do. They would write a letter of apology to their children, saying sorry for abandoning them for a life of crime. And this has turned into a year-long program where these fathers get together. They're called the Malachi Dads. And they support each other in learning to be better dads, doing parenting classes, and beginning to build a relationship with their children, some who they haven't seen for years. Now, once a year, the children of these Malachi dads are flown to the prison to enjoy a fun day with their father, where they can just do ordinary things like face painting and games and eat pizza. but also begin a face-to-face conversation about where dad went wrong and took some wrong turns and how they might live their life differently. For many men, learning about how to be a better dad is really another way of learning to be a better man. And for them, this opportunity is translating into becoming mentors to younger inmates, many of whom have never had a father present or good male role models.
So in different settings and programs, the theme remains similar. Inmates wake up to live the choice to live out of something other than bitterness, rage, resentment, unforgiveness, and choose to look outwards to something greater than themselves. Here is one very inglorious way in which some inmates chose to do that.
Let me tell you about Anthony, the man you just heard there in the video, describing his sentence as living out life with love. Anthony is one of the men I trained as a mentor. He's serving a mere 40 years for armed robbery. Soon after his sentence began, his infant twin sons drowned in a swimming pool. He knew that he hadn't been there to save them because he was in prison. I think living with that knowledge could do a great deal of damage to a man, closing him down in bitterness and despair. But Anthony chose to serve and mentor those he could reach instead. He coaches basketball, he's joined the Hospice team, and having graduated from Bible college, he became the imam at the prison. Incredibly, he talks about Angola being the best thing that ever happened to him, that he was living his so-called free life so destructively and compulsively, and that just like silver and gold need to be purified through fire, so has he been refined by his experiences there. And now he sums it up: I'm living out life with love. So a few years ago, he, along with a few other lifers, were approached by senior state judges to become mentors to young offenders. And these judges asked Anthony and the others, what kind of criminals can we send you? They said non-violent, non-sex offenders. Young men who would be getting a 10 to 15-year sentence, but instead get the opportunity to join the re-entry program. So they serve the first 2 years of their sentence, which gives the mentors 24 months to help them turn around. If they get kicked off the program, their sentence goes back up to what it originally would have been, maybe 10 to 15 years, and they're living in the main prison. The first 90 days is spent in rehab. They're tested for aptitude, and then they're given a vocational skill. They're taught to read by older inmates and tutored for their high school diploma. Their average reading age or educational age is around a 9-year-old's when they come to the prison. Then they go on the 12 Steps program, victim awareness, financial planning, anger management, and parenting courses. But the main effort is the life coaching, living in the same dorm, learning what it means to be in community, and being fathered by a good role model like Anthony. And the intention is that young guys are shown how to respect themselves and others, how to realize ambition, how to live peacefully when you don't get on with someone, and through all of this, to experience themselves for the first time as disciplined, courageous, and successful. Now, when they're released back into their communities, they're sent back as trained community leaders, and the reoffending rates are down to 12%. If you imagine in this country, reoffending rates are well above 60, probably more. So it's down to 12%. And yet that relationship with their mentors remains crucial, and they will go back and spend time visiting with their mentors at Angola. When I worked with these men, we used a very simple model which sees integrity as a practice. It's not something you just have, it's a practice. It's an activity, a way of life. Firstly, are you willing to look at your life? Plenty of inmates are not and continue to blame the world and others for their mistakes. But for those who were, we then asked, are you willing to see what is actually going on in your life? And then tell the truth about it, not hiding behind excuses, justifications, blame, or vagueness of thought. Finally, all this then has to lead to action. So where do I need to take truthful action to restore integrity and coherence? Of course, this process demands a whole lot of other things to be present too. Courage, discipline, respect. Sound familiar? So, I just want to reiterate 2 questions and have you reflect on these. How would you be if you were locked up for the rest of your life? And what would you become? How would it shape you over the decades, living within these physical, emotional, and psychological constraints?
Now, we've all got a view of what a role model is. And I think if you do a quick Google search, you might find these 3 examples of what Google believes to be a role model. Now, you're all probably sitting there and thinking, why did you go to Louisiana State Penitentiary? Maybe because it's in the US and it's a good visit, but actually from what you've heard and seen already, there's some threads and some things that we can certainly learn. From my perspective, I wanted to better understand role modeling and how it was seen through a non-military prism. Note, my experience for the last 20 years has been seen through a wholly military prism. Was it different anywhere else? Less looking at sporting icons, which many of us do, I was unsure where else to look for guidance. And having heard Joanna's story, I knew that Angola was a unique, slightly adverse environment, and I was not disappointed. So I thought I had an idea of what a role model was, because maybe I'd read it in a book and some of my own experiences. But actually, the visit to Angola was a life-changing experience for me. The men that we encountered were the most humblest of men, and you looked into their eyes, and they were the most humblest of men, who, through their actions, had so much power at their fingertips. They used that power to benefit the lives of others, which for me was really inspirational. So over the years, if you've heard, they've turned themselves around. They daily demonstrate integrity, loyalty, discipline, courage, etc. as they serve the others around them. And I sat in the room, and you can see on the photo, of convicted felons. I'd met them about 10 minutes earlier, with well over 100 years of sentences, no prison guards, nobody else in the room, bar Joanna. I was absolutely blown away with their insights into how they lived their daily lives, showing courage and integrity. I also went because I wanted to better define what a role model is. And in ATR Winchester, we try and get our young section commanders to be role models to the recruits that they train. So the first question I asked Assistant Warden Gary Young, who ran the re-entry program, was, tell me what you think. What's your definition of a role model? And his deep, darkest South accent, which I won't go into, it's really easy. It's about vocational role modeling and social role modeling. So what do we really mean by those? Well, vocational role models is relatively straightforward. It's sort of the teaching. It's giving people a skill. And at Angola, those teachers are the lifers who over the years have learnt the skills. They've qualified themselves as teachers, and they're now teaching the young re-entry mentees and others around them. In the prison itself, it's got the biggest high school in the state, and we spent some time with the headmistress or the principal there, who said, as you've heard, we are training people with reading ages from 9 years old upwards and giving their high school diplomas. The students attend class on a daily basis, as you've heard. Some go and work in the field, some go and go into the classrooms. They learn a skill, they get a trade, they get academic qualifications to better themselves as people. Now, in our terms, in Army terms, put simply, this is what our instructors do in our training establishments. They train young people in giving them skills. Now, that might be how to handle a weapon. It might be how to do your CBRN training, your first aid training. But this is stuff that we do in the Army. Now, social role modelling is about drawing out good character. It's about being approachable. It's about setting the right example by living and breathing the values and standards of the organisation or the society that you're part of. For me, it's about being authentic. Now, what struck us as Angola is that social mentoring is a foundation for all the practical and vocational learning for that to be a success. Now, interestingly, you would have thought that the relationship between the prison officer and the inmate would be the one that we would think of being the instructor to the recruit sort of relationship. However, this is a really bad case study, as you've already heard, because of the pay differentials, the fact that there is a lot of corruption in the prison officers. So that wasn't a good one to model, and it's actually the one between the young re-entry mentee and the mentor, which is a great case study. So the key thing from this, and again which makes it more authentic, is that the mentors live alongside the people that they train, setting the right example. One of the guys, the head, sort of the lead mentor, is a guy called George Gillam. And actually he said it's really easy. He said, all you have to do is walk the walk, not talk the talk. So if we want our recruits to improve and excel in their vocation, then clearly it makes sense that we train our trainers in the practice and the art of social mentoring.
So what does all this mean for us? What can we take away from this story as the Army rediscovers the concept of the wise warrior? When I wrote to Warden Kane before I went to Angola, I wrote that everybody lives behind bars of some sort. For most of us, those are emotional, psychological, and perhaps even spiritual. But for your charges, it's all of those and physical bars as well. And yet, even behind those bars, we have a choice about who we're going to be and what we're going to live for and how we're going to show up in our daily life and encounters. And that is freedom. Now, what has taken place at Angola is extreme in its particularities, but the trajectory is universal. When a person is wound up, anxious, depressed, or disconnected, their thinking will be muddy. So their actions will be compulsive, reckless, uncooperative, and weak. When we're well-rooted, we are able to see clearly and make wise decisions. We're not criminals, and yet all of us get caught up from time to time in negative, anxious, compulsive thinking, and that affects our behavior, whether it's reacting out of emotion on the battlefield, or judging others harshly, or acting as if the trauma of the past is still present, or shutting down creative problem solving and solution finding, and so on. Criminal behaviour has extreme consequences, but all of us create consequences by the way we see the world. The work I participated in at Angola was about establishing mentoring relationships that strengthened and enabled young men to see that our thoughts create our experience. And to live with strength and wisdom is to not get hooked by every thought that occurs to us. Rather, to be able to look without compulsion, choose wisely, and live with integrity, because at root, this is how human beings are designed to function best. Of course, the thing is that with criminals, the hope and the expectation is that they will have this wake-up moment where they realize that they're free to realize and choose a different life. But none of us particularly expect that. Soldiers get their job, they're on their career path. Nobody's particularly hoping that some great wake-up call's going to happen. And that's one of the harder things about a military context rather than a prison context. We have to be deliberate about training our people as mentors, deliberately making space for them to wake up to new ways of being, seeing the world, thinking, and approaching their vocations.
So since returning from the prison, Joanna runs a mentoring course for the staff and character development sessions for the recruits, which enables them to step back and look at their conclusions, judgments, prejudices, anxieties, and so on, so that they can choose to live with integrity, discipline, and courage all of the time. Now, so what does that mean for me? Well, I identified that many of our instructors arrive with varying degrees of experiences, and you can accept that from a diverse army, but also with diverse qualifications, and we expect a lot of them. So we expect them to teach the new skills, the vocational skills, as I've alluded to, but we also expect them to be a good character and have good character and be a good role model and mentor. So take, for example, the young REME section commander, and it could be any CAT badge, who has recently promoted to corporal. He's been a vehicle mechanic for his career to date, 3 or 4 years, 5 years maybe. He has not been on exercise for a while because he's been in a teaching organisation. He's got no instructional experience, and he's just done his skill at arms course. He's got very little experience of running a section. And we expect these guys and girls to come in and nail their lessons, deliver them to the highest standard, achieve the key learning points and the training objectives from the get-go, as well as do everything else. Now, naturally, and we see it, he'll be slightly apprehensive, nervous, and probably slightly reserved, possibly less approachable than maybe someone who's a bit more confident. So what I want to do is try and remove this sort of angst and provide them with the ability to accept that the classroom stuff is really important and they can teach those skills, but it's actually the activity that goes on in the lines at night time, which the ability to interact, to listen, to chat on to the people you're charged with, that actually has a more positive effect, and the positive effect you can see in the classroom during the daytime. And that hopefully will inspire the young recruit to learn. So our induction package for our instructors now has a slot for teaching the sort of stuff about how to use the MOS page and how to teach a lesson and the coach and mentoring side of that. But it also has a slot provided by Joanna, which talks about how to be a good social mentor and a good role model. And it's just a start. We then take this a bit further. We've now started to develop, as we've alluded to, a sort of a social mentoring course where the instructors can come down and talk about their challenges and how they can do business. Now, whilst it's still in its early days, the instructors do see the benefit, and it provides them with the skills required to better lead the young recruits charged to them. They're more approachable, they're more authentic, while still remaining very, very professional. And that's a key thing. They're still professional throughout. So rather than expect them to learn these skills through time served, we're hopefully better equipping them from the start of their time with us. And ultimately, we want to get that to be the norm. Because we've noted that it really takes instructors about 2 courses, maybe 28 weeks, probably about 8 to 12 months to really get into their stride and understand, as I say, it's not just about teaching those new skills, it's about understanding your people. And I sat only yesterday, with a leaving interview with one of my section commanders who said that it took him 2 courses to really understand it. And he said, the key thing for me was you've got to think before you act. Think before you act. But I want to do more, and I want to, as I'm doing now, talking to you guys about it, but I want to develop a sort of a train the trainer package where people can come in from the wider army, whatever walk of life you come from, and sit, and we can signpost you areas in which you can develop yourselves in order that you become a better social mentor or a role model. So, please watch this space, sort of more to follow on that.
So, as we wrap up, I just want to leave you with some questions to ponder and consider. First one, what would it take for me to be the best person that I can be? Where might muddy thinking be eroding my integrity? Where does lack of courage prevent me from doing what I set out to do? And how might I support others? And how might I allow others to support me?
And finally, I think, just as we close, above all, we've got our freedom, and these people haven't.